Good afternoon from China, or good morning to some of you, and good evening. My name is Fraser Bewick, and I'm an academic manager with the British Council in China, specifically in Nanjing today. A very big welcome to you all, and thank you for those of you who are attending the second in the series. This is the Teacher Takeaways, Practical Ideas for Classroom Teaching series, brought to you in cooperation with the British Council EES and with the China English Teacher Professional Teachers Association, abbreviated ETA. So it's great to have everyone here today, and hopefully you'll be joining us for the following sessions. Today's session is looking at reviewing lesson objectives, structure and task design to help plan varied and effective lessons. We have an hour today, which is not a huge amount of time, so we will be glossing over certain aspects of this. And of course, I will have made a few assumptions about what the teachers who are joining us today might know. I hope my assumptions are correct. If not, please do put any questions you have in the chat box. As always, we'll go through the housekeeping in just a moment. I do want to mention that today's focus will largely be towards language classes, because we do have another event on October 12th, which I'll be sharing information about at the end of today. So please do stick with us until the end if you can. And that session will be on teaching listening, looking more at receptive skills. Housekeeping, for those of you who were with us in the last session, you will know that this is a Zoom webinar. So unfortunately, that means that we don't have microphones or video for the audience today. However, you can have your say through the chat box, or indeed, if you want to ask a question, you can use the Q&A box that's provided at the bottom of your screen. As before, we may not be able to answer all of the questions on the day, but we will provide a Q&A worksheet with the video recording downloadable. And this will be provided, the link to this will be provided at the end of today. So the questions that we can't answer live, we will be answering and sharing with you through download. So please do ask a question, it will be answered. We will try and leave 10 minutes for that at the end, but because we have such a short amount of time, I do prefer to make sure that we cover everything we want to cover first, and the questions hopefully can be squeezed in at the end. So let's move forward. Now, the first thing, of course, we want to focus on is what we want to achieve today. So 4 key things, as you can see, and I've underlined certain verbs within these objectives that I have, because these will become more important later in the session. I would like to consider how teachers might promote autonomy, and autonomy for me personally, and I'm sure to many teachers, is something we do try and achieve when it comes to student learning, both for motivational and for learning purposes. So we want to look at how we might do that through different lesson models or structures and activities. I'll be providing a few examples today. We also want to highlight some different task types and their purpose, because I do find as a teacher trainer, it's something that teachers do think about, but perhaps not always. We do tend to have a tendency in some cases to move towards fun activities without always considering what the purpose of the activity is. So I think it's interesting and useful to look at that today and reflect on that. We also want to look at key questions that we can ask at the planning stage. I'm certainly a big advocate of planning. Obviously, when we do training courses, when I did the CELTA course years ago, we did go into this in a great amount of detail. And for many teachers, you don't have the time to do that. You have 30 classes a week, 25, 20 classes a week, and the planning is often what suffers first. But hopefully the questions and the steps that we can offer can at least make that planning stage more efficient when we're thinking about what we want to teach. And finally, I'd like to introduce the SMART technique and some examples for writing objectives. And we'll do that at the end of today, because I think it's useful to build up to that through the tasks that we want to show. So let's move forward with this. These 3 words I showed in the first session on thinking skills. For those of you who didn't attend that, again, the QR code at the end of today's session can link you to that. Adapt, adopt, reject. I'd like everyone to approach today with an analytical point of view, a perspective, if you like. And I'd like you to look at the activities and the suggestions in the frame or the prism of these 3 words. Can you adapt this to your practice? Can you adopt it exactly as you see it, or is it something that you need to reject? And if you need to reject it, that's fine, because everyone's context is different and we have to find out what works for us. So I always like to highlight these 3 words at the beginning, so they are in our minds, in our heads for the session ahead. Now, one of the assumptions I've made is that many of the teachers today will be quite familiar with these abbreviations and these models of teaching. So PPP, and I'll highlight what the acronyms stand for. PPP is perhaps the most widely used, certainly in China and in many of the other countries I've been to. Presentation of language, practice of language, and then freer production of language is a very common structure used in classes. And of course, it's a very safe structure for teachers in terms of what they want to plan, what they want to teach, what the students will get. But as we move towards test, teach, test, which offers a little bit more flexibility in the lesson, i.e. giving the students a test to see what they do know or where they might need help within a very narrow scope of language. So maybe some choices, for example, do we want to teach the past simple, the past continuous, or the present perfect today, a certain aspect of the present perfect? We can give the students a test to see where students need the most help. And then on that test, or on the basis of that test, we can then teach what we want to teach and then test again after we've taught that. So there's still a limited amount of scope, but more flexibility for the teacher. And finally, task-based learning, which is building from a task and then analyzing and evaluating what language the students might need to complete the task. So these 3 models of teaching are on a continuum from top to bottom. If you look on the left, it says these lesson models are increasingly. Can anyone finish the sentence for me, please? Anything in the chat box that finishes that sentence on the left? I can hear you typing. Demanding, okay. Certainly for the teacher, student-centered, great. Grow, yep, okay, so in terms of development, challenging, yes, both for the teacher and for the student. And that's often, I feel, why it's not used in lessons, that teachers do feel it can be quite difficult to plan for and to manage, but there are rewards that can come from it. So flexible, high, I assume that's not in response to the sentence. Personalized, okay, good, yeah, that's also very important. It's becoming something that's more personal to the learner, not something that's prescribed by the teacher. If you can take the analogy of a doctor, if you went to see the doctor, would you like something that's prescribed by the doctor or something that you decide yourself? For medicine, that's fine, but for language, we often can show what we need much more clearly by ourselves. So the word I'm going to highlight here is student-centered. So well done, Syrian. Thank you for your answer. These are moving to more student-centered forms. Now, here's a diagrammatic representation of the 3 forms. So for those of you who are familiar with them, A, B, and C, which is which? If you could again just put in the chat. A is what? Is it TBL, PPP, or, okay, we've got A is TBL, thank you, Amin, great. B, okay, I'll take that. A is definitely TBL, certainly we can see the word task. C is TTT, B is TBL, no, we've got A is TBL, B is PPP, and C is TTT, excellent. So I think, thank you to, oh, we've lost it there, so Yulia, we have it there as well. So thank you for the answers. That's great. A is TBL, B is PPP, and C is TTT. So why am I showing you this? Well, the important thing here is to think about, when does the teacher teach the language? So I'm going to highlight PPP first. We know that's B. In PPP, the language is taught by the teacher at the beginning, because the teacher has decided, this is what I'm going to teach, and this is what I'm going to make sure students learn. However, with TTT, there's more choice. Now, the teacher still knows roughly what they're going to teach and has to prepare materials accordingly, but there may be a choice of what students will learn because the teacher's looking at where the need is greatest. However, when it comes to the task-based learning, the teaching is coming at the end or nearer the end of the lesson. And what is that telling us? Well, as we saw in the last slide, it's making the lesson more student-centered. So we can see a slope going down in this table where the teach section of the lesson is being pushed further back. And what this does is allows more chance for the students to discover the rules of the language that we're teaching before the teacher is there to teach or to confirm them. Now, we've all, I'm sure everyone is a teacher on this webinar today, and we've all taught language and taught it in different ways. I believe that most people, again, it's an assumption that I have made, will be familiar with PPP. TTT might be perhaps something that people are slightly less familiar with. So I wanted to give an example of what a test might be, because by looking at the word test, we might be thinking of quiz or exam or something along those lines. And to some extent, that is what we're talking about, because we are checking whether students know something or don't know something. So in that essence, in that sense, it's a test. So let me give you a very simple example of this. A test that I've used quite often with test, teach, test lessons is a mingle activity, which means that students will be able to move around the class and speak to other students. So it's important it's not just to one student. This gives the students a chance to speak to different people, to reformulate language in different ways, because the other students might correct them, or they might hear other students using other versions of the language that are correct. But it also importantly gives the teacher a chance to monitor for common mistakes. And with test, teach, test, this is important because we have to evaluate which area we're going to focus on in the teach. So a simple test might be this. I would give out strips of paper with these words, and the students hold the paper and they walk around, and when they see another student, they meet another student, they make a sentence. Now, students often make mistakes here. They might use the present simple. They might use the past simple. They might use the past continuous. They might make mistakes as they try to make those tenses. And that's what the teacher is listening out for. To keep this task going, when the student reads their sentence and the other student reads their sentence, the students will swap sentences and move to find another partner. So the mingle keeps going, and there's a continual reformulation and reuse of sentences. And it's motivating because it's not just the same sentence every time. So each new sentence is a new challenge for the students. But what the teacher is doing is listening for the mistakes that the students are making, because that's helping the student, helping the teacher decide what they want to teach. So the teacher will essentially have 3 pathways for their lesson. It could be past simple, it could be past continuous, it could be present perfect, a certain aspect of the present perfect, for example. And based on what happens in test 1, they will choose one of those pathways. This, of course, means more work for the teacher in preparation, but we are giving the students more autonomy. And as the teacher is planning the language and the lesson to be taught, we can also keep it within the bounds of the curriculum that you're teaching. So there is some control there for the teacher, but more autonomy. So if we look at these structures in a slightly a different way, because I think this is quite a nice diagrammatic way of showing it. The first blocks here is a standard PPP lesson. You have your lead in, you have the language focus or the teach, as we said before, control practice, and then a freer practice that will perhaps offer opportunity to use the language students have learned, but also other language, and importantly, other language. So it becomes gradually a more natural presentation of language. If we look at the legend below, we can see what the colors represent. The next one, test, teach, test. Again, you can see the test is there, that's the diagnostic. And then from that, we go into the explicit language focus, whether it's the teach or the control practice, and we move to freer practice. With task-based learning, we have the task, which is generally productive, where students get to complete the task. It could be writing or written work. It could be speaking or spoken work. And then there's the feedback stage, both the teacher and the students feeding back on how it went, what problems they had. And from this, the teacher can make a decision on what needs to be taught. And then generally there's a freer section where the task is either repeated, the students can try the task again and improve on it, or there's some follow-up from the task. So this obviously will be down to the teacher, how they plan these stages, and there is some flexibility there. But we can see that the teaching aspect is being pushed further and further back to give the students more chance to discover things for themselves. And discover is an interesting word, because if we consider text-based language lessons, which often have language presented a bit earlier in the lesson, but often also give great student autonomy, we can see that these lessons offer us another opportunity to promote autonomy. With text-based language lessons, we have the lead-in or the warmer, whichever it is at the beginning. And then we're going to use a text as the basis for language. So rather in a teacher-centered approach where the teacher will be presenting the language, or perhaps even in a task-based approach where the task is defining the language that's needed, a fixed text is often used. Now, teachers will explore the text initially to ensure the context is clear, because the context will be crucial at the learning stage to understand how the language is used. This might be done through simple gist tasks or scanning tasks, for example, just to give the students enough chance to explore the text a little bit. And from that, then the teacher may start to look at the language focus, but rather than the teacher teaching the language, we're using tasks that can discover the language. So this is something we often refer to as guided discovery. Tasks such as sentences with gaps, and the gaps have the key structure, and students have to find the structure in the text and put it into the gaps, and therefore helping them to notice the structure of the language we're teaching. That's an example of a text-based language lesson. And of course, it will move from control practice into a freer practice task, similar to the other language lessons. So these are stages, or common stages of language lessons. And there are others, there are ways to change this and to mix it around, but these are common, bog standard, if you like, language structures and models. I am glossing over this a little bit because I want to focus not so much on the model itself, but on the stages, because that's what we want to focus on and concentrate on today. But the first part of this that I'd like to focus on is the blue part. You can see there's a lot of blue there, and unsurprisingly so, because this is a language lesson and therefore there will be some language focus. Something that we often use as teachers, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this, is a term MPF and A. Can anyone tell me what MPF and A stands for? In the chat box, if you will. Great, Daniela, thank you. Meaning, form, pronunciation, and what's A? A is the one we often forget, or it's certainly one of the most difficult parts to teach. Great, appropriacy. Thank you very much, Daniela. So these are common aspects that we need to focus on when we focus on a language lesson. If you've done the CELTA or the Trinity or any of the reputable TESOL or TEFL certificate courses, the trainer will probably have introduced you to this terminology. And it's really useful to consider if you're teaching language. Obviously, you can't create language analysis sheets in such detail for every lesson, but to have it in our heads is a very useful way of approaching the lesson. But MPF, of course, is one way to do it. And if it's teaching the meaning, the pronunciation, and then the form, often it's going to be a teacher-centered lesson. However, if we're using meaning first, i.e. exploring a text, then allowing the students to go into the text and bring out the language, then we don't have MPF, we have MFP. And that way we're starting to think about the teaching of the language in a more student-centered way. So it's not only about the way we present the model, but also the way we want to present the language within the teach section that can help us to make the lesson more student-centered. This is a quote that's a particular favorite of mine, Piaget, and it's something that I think really helps to encapsulate why we're talking about student autonomy and student-centered lessons. When you teach a child something, you take away forever his or her chance of discovering it for him or herself. And I think that's something that's important as teachers. And going back to the last session we had on thinking skills, we are trying to develop certain whole self skills, if I can put it that way, amongst students, not just passively absorbing knowledge and information. We are developing the capability and the capacity in students to learn for themselves. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. So this brings me to tasks. And this is where, when I speak to teachers, I like to move away from the lesson as a whole and think about the stages or the tasks. Because when we create a task or an activity, it's important that we think about why we're doing it. And very few teachers I see, and understandably given the time, think about stage outcomes or objectives. Mainly we focus on the lesson objectives and outcomes. But how do we build up to that lesson objective or outcome? And we do that through the stages of our lesson. So thinking about what our task is trying to achieve. For example, is it something that tries to teach the student something? And this might be the guided discovery task, for example, where students are learning or noticing things by doing the task. Is it practice or review? We find that many games are review activities, something we've taught previously, and now the students are having a chance to practice it. So if we're doing games throughout the lesson, are we actually presenting anything new? Or indeed, are we adapting the game to be able to teach something? Is the game being used as a test to test what the students know now, and then use that to decide what you want to teach? So a test can lead to a teach. But this, of course, is starting to make us think about the order of the tasks and why we're actually putting them in our lesson in that order. Finally, is the task just to present some contextual information that perhaps is not specific to the language we're teaching, but might be of interest, it might be motivating, engaging to the students in the lesson? For example, asking pre-reading questions about a text, for example, and starting to understand what students know and perhaps presenting some interesting background information. So these are 4 key activity purposes, I call them. And often these are the main activity purposes we'll have in a lesson. So how are we using them and where are we using them in our lesson? We then have to think about how do we do this? How do we execute this? What are we going to do to set up this task? What questions will we ask? How can students answer them? And this takes us back to closed and open questions in our last session. Are we making sure that students understand clearly what they have to do, which would be an ICQ or an instruction checking question, for example? Or are we helping students to go deeper and understand the concept of something, which would be a CCQ, concept checking questions? But these questions are questions that we can plan into our lesson if we think it's something we really should use at that stage. It does help us to remember. Off the cuff, off the top of our heads, it's very easy to forget these things as we're teaching. The other question I ask here is, are the students motivated? And I'll get to that in just a second, because I do think motivation is crucial when it comes to presenting tasks. Finally, harking back to our first session on thinking skills, can we adapt the task or develop it so that students can develop different thinking skills? These are things that we can consider as we design our lesson. So going back to motivation, this is a familiar scene, I'm sure, in many classrooms. Please excuse my artwork, it's rather poor, but I've done my best here to highlight what I mean. Students are bored. And why are they bored? Well, they're bored because the teacher is presenting the lesson in a way that's not engaging or interesting to them. And that's not always possible, but there are ways that we can think about this and we can adapt our lesson to do so, because when we have this cause, of course, we have this effect. Or indeed, We have boring to bored. Perhaps a nice way to teach those two adjective forms. So what can we do to help the students be more engaged in the lesson? Because if they're more engaged, they're generally going to be more autonomous and work on the tasks that we want. And often autonomy will engender more motivation within the students as well. Here's an example that I have used in my lesson, and it's something I don't use so often because it will come down to the age group and the students that you work with and how complex or complicated the language is. For those of you who have done the CELTA or Trinity or any of the other in-depth TEFL courses or masters, this is essentially like asking the students to do their own language analysis. So I've highlighted the word teach here because the purpose of this activity is for the students to teach themselves and to learn. And the Freer model is very simple, and I'm going to use a simple example here, but you could use it for any key terms. It could be even things like metaphors, anything that might require more in-depth research for the students. Importantly, this is something that doesn't have to be done by the student alone. It can be done in a collaborative way or even as a project if you extend this into multiple words, for example, or indeed you could adapt it. And I'd love to hear your adaptations for this as well. So I've used the word turtle. It's a very simple word, so fairly low level, but students, even with the word turtle, they may not be thinking about all the aspects or the things that are behind the word turtle. And there are many misconceptions or misunderstandings with words. I'm using this just as a simple example. So first of all, we have a definition. And of course, this definition is quite complicated, but what we would want is for the student to do this as much as possible in their own words. This is my own words. For another student, a student at lower level, of course, that might be quite different. So the definition, getting the students to find the definition and write it out in their own words, but then breaking it down into key characteristics, because this might help them not only to identify what it is, but to identify what it is not. And this is really important. And think about the concept checking questions that you ask students when you're teaching in your lesson. You're often not asking what it is, but you're using what it's not to help students separate the meaning of the key term or word or whatever it might be that you're teaching and something very close to that they could misunderstand. So the characteristics can help with that. Examples, I've used sea turtle, snapping turtle. There are different ways the word turtle can be used. And again, this is expanding the student's vocabulary. Whatever the word is, it could be in a sentence, it could be in a short phrase if you think that's important, or the student does, but they're expanding on their vocabulary beyond just a single word. And of course, what it's not. A tortoise, a turtle is not a tortoise. Often they're misunderstood or misconstrued and confused. But in this case, we can be clear. And if a student can find that, then obviously they're starting to really analyze the word turtle. And that word analyze is important. If you remember, that was one of the higher order thinking skills in Bloom's taxonomy. So this task is not only helping students to go deeper into the language, but also developing thinking skills at the same time. But importantly, in this activity, I could confidently say it's teaching because students are learning from it by researching and filling in the form. So let's look at a different activity. The first one was students doing it by themselves. They're motivated by the need to complete it. Maybe the teacher will check it. Maybe they get to compare with other students, so they want to be a bit better than the other students. Typhoon is a game that is much more fun, but can also be used to motivate students. In this game, I give groups of students 10 points, and I have a grid on the board that you can see on the right-hand side. On this grid are symbols, and the meanings of the symbols you can see on the left-hand side here. So if you get the money symbol, you get 10 points. If you get the rocket symbol, you can destroy 10 points of another team. If you get the robber symbol, you can steal 5 points from another team. That means they lose 5 points, but you gain 5 points. And if you get typhoon, you lose all your points. So it's a game of choice and a game of chance. And I think this is important because not only does it give strong students a chance to get involved and show what they can do, but it also gives the students who might be weaker a chance to be involved as well and to potentially win the game. There might be nothing more demotivating than always being on the losing side of a game, but with typhoon, that's not always the case. So if you see, I would then cover up the items on the grid and cover the whole grid, which would have different symbols, give the students their 10 points, and then they would have a grid something like this, where they can tell me the square they want by choosing A2, and then I would take away A2, for example, or A1. I'll show that in just a second. But before we get to this choice part, the important thing is we want to make sure there's a language component. In this case, typhoon is often used for review. So this is an example of a review task. Teachers could ask a question based on what's already taught. The group that answers correctly, now you can do this as first to answer, or you can do it 1, 2, 3, 4 to make sure everyone has a chance. Once they've answered that question correctly, then they get a choice at the board. And this choice could be a win, it could be a loss, and they don't know until they make the choice. So even if they answer the question correctly, they may not win the game. And this makes it engaging for the whole class. Everyone wants to know what's behind the square. At the end, we count up who the winner is based on the points. So for example, if the first group answered the question, chose A1 or C1, then they would get the robber mask and they could steal 5 points from another group. The next group might choose B2. Unfortunately, they get nothing. They don't lose anything, they don't get anything. The next group might choose D3. Oh no, typhoon. That means they lose all their points. So the game often becomes a game of fun, a game of revenge in some cases if other teams have taken away points. And importantly, even the loser can win. So there's a strong motivational aspect to this game, but it is a review task. So keeping in mind the task. Now, here are 6 words that I'd like to show you. And these words are also related to autonomy. And again, autonomy is linking to motivation. The more choice students have, the more motivated they might be to complete the task. Can you tell me what word is behind each of the numbers? And this will take you some skimming of the text that you see here. Hopefully it's clear enough. You can just put in the chat box number 1 and then a single word that you think is hidden by the arrows. This word represents something we can use to develop autonomy in our tasks. What do we have? Let's see. Okay, I'll give a few more seconds. If we don't have anything in the chat box, I will reveal the first one. 1, perceived knowledge. Okay, good guess, Daniela, thank you. Even simpler than that, a single word. Each one is only a single word. Interest, okay. The answer is actually in the first sentence, so just to give you a clue. Known, okay, preparation, interest. Okay, great. Well, I'll give you the first one, which is fairly simple. Choice, giving students choice. So I did say it was simple. Making sure students have a choice of what they want to learn as much as possible. And of course, as we look at the lesson models at the beginning today, we can see that student choice becomes more prominent as we move through those student-centered tasks, or from teacher-centered to student-centered. Number 2, anyone? Any number 2, plan? Great, planning, I'll take that. Thank you, Simon. Simon, I think, is that how you pronounce it? I hope so. Great. Number 3, anyone? I think this one is quite difficult. Thank you, Simon. Design. Okay. Now this one is a difficult one, so I'll present this to you. Latitude. So not only do they have the choice of the topics and the themes, but they have the choice of how wide these topics or themes can be. So the scope of the activity is very important. Now, this is something that can be done in negotiation with the teacher, or depending on the task you want to do, you can build it into the task. Number 4, anyone? Okay, we've got Lily. Thank you, Lily. We've got that. Rehearsal, good. Giving the students a chance to practice it, particularly when it comes to freer practice activities. Giving students a chance to really think about the language they're going to use before they do it, so they're not thinking about it on the spot. Good. 5, revision. Okay, I'll take that one. Thank you, Leon. Feedback, not only teacher feedback, but student feedback as well. Get them involved in the feedback sessions. And finally, Simon, again, thank you, reflection. So these are 6 key ways that we can adapt a task to make it more autonomous. Now, as an example here, this is taken from the British Council's Teaching for Success material. An information gap is quite simply where you have, for example, one student, student A and student B, and student A has information student B needs, so they must ask questions to get that information. Student B has information student A needs, and they must ask questions to get that information. So it means there's a need to communicate, which is a very useful way of thinking about your tasks. Is there a need to communicate, or can students just answer it by themselves? If they can answer a task by themselves, then it's very unlikely they'll be motivated to communicate or speak with a partner. So here we see planning, choosing, and latitude is in the initial stages of the task to give that scope for students to adapt the task to their needs. Moving into rehearsal to make sure they're familiar with the language they want to use. If this were a role play, obviously they could become familiar with the language that their character might use. Rehearsal can be an important part of any communicative activity. And then finally, feedback and reflection, being able to look back at what we've done and critique it. And if we remember critique from thinking skills, and if I'm referring back to the thinking skills webinar and you weren't there, I do recommend you go back and look at it. We'll share a QR code at the end of today. But critique was an element of evaluation. So again, we're starting to develop thinking skills, particularly higher order thinking skills. So that's an example of how we might use it with a simple information gap activity. And here are the words nicely laid out. So 6 key areas that we can adapt our tasks in to promote autonomy. Now, let's take this forward a little bit to the planning stage, or take this back, I should say, a little bit to the planning stage. Let's think about how we can plan our lessons, because often when we think of our lessons, they're wonderful in our heads, they're excellent, they seem so logical, and there's no way that no one could understand it. But from the student's perspective, they don't have what we have in our heads as we plan the lessons. So we need to really think logically, not only about what we're going to do, but how we're going to do it to support and to scaffold the students' understanding. So the planning stage, for me, I'm a huge advocate of planning and spending time planning. Obviously, we want to do so in an efficient way, but planning is a huge part of it. What we have to do as teachers to make sure what we do teach is actually effective. So I'd like to introduce you to some steps that I consider at the planning stage, and I'm going to transfer these into questions in the next slide. I'd also like you to think about how this relates to tasks and activities. We've mentioned the different types of tasks, but how do these steps link to that? So we have considering the purpose, of course, the objectives, the outcomes, and we'll come to that in a moment. We want to think about how to start to engage the students, whether this is a lead-in, whether this is a warmer that has no connection to the lesson, it's just something that's fun. We want to think about how to engage the students in the lesson, and that comes down to the tasks. For example, those that we've seen: autonomous, motivating, fun, competitive tasks. But of course, we need to keep in mind what is the purpose of those tasks and how does it link to the purpose of our lesson. We also want to consider how we can encourage collaboration. Again, I'm also a big advocate of collaboration. Students can complete tasks by themselves, they can notice things by themselves, but of course there's the old adage, 2 heads are better than 1. So by students working together, they can share more ideas, compare, and work together to evaluate the tasks. So collaboration can be a very strong and useful element of any task and really improve what the students get from it, or increase what they get from it. We want to, of course, in a language lesson, consider how students will process the language. Is it in a teacher-centered manner? Is it in a student-centered manner? And what follow-up activities are going to ensure that they understand the language that has been taught? And of course, from our perspective, we want to make sure that the meaning, the form, the pronunciation, and the appropriacy have been communicated to the students. And it's something that is important when we think about how much we want to teach in a lesson, because it can be tempting to squeeze as much as we can to get through a certain number of pages or content. But is the student actually taking in that information? Are they actually learning from it? Or are we just presenting lots of information and the students are, oh, I'm so confused, just like in the image that I showed you in the last slide. And finally, we want to consider how to round up. This is my step-by-step thoughts as I plan my lesson. And there's one more that I'd like to add here, and it relates back to what we did in the last webinar. Again, if you haven't seen that webinar, please do check out the recording. But that's to think about how we can develop thinking skills. Can we tweak the activities to help develop them? Now, here are the questions that I mentioned. 9 steps which have questions. I've blanked out a few key words here. Can anyone tell me what these words might be? So we're using your just reading skills to come up with a best guess for some of these words. Please do have a guess. What do you think? I'll have 5 seconds or 10 seconds, then I'll show the first one as an example. Step 1, we've got objective there, so good. I'm going to show that one. So we have objective. I use the word purpose, but essentially it's the same thing. Good. So for me, the purpose is the kind of the grander focus, and then we'll break that down into smaller objectives that meet that purpose. Step 4, question. Okay. What else we got? 2 tasks and activities. Okay. Activities. Yep. Good. Good. Okay. A lot of people going for activity with step 2. Okay. You could put that in there. I like to think about how we start the lesson. Is it something that engages? Is it something that gets people interested in a lesson? That's something that I think we can, it might be a video, something that really gets people's attention in the lesson. But the activities will come at some point. Caption, ideas, lead in. Okay, good. That's certainly, I think, part of step 2. 3 ideas. Okay, good. Key ideas or concepts. Good. So that would come down to objectives, breaking it down. Good. How do I create an engaging start? Good. So I'm just going to display them now. We've got some great ideas there for students. We want to engage the students for sure, but we want to have an engaging start to the lesson. Someone mentioned lead in already. Visuals and questions that are going to be used to help clarify. Again, this is where I mentioned in feedback, concept checking questions, anything that we might need to include. How do I involve the students? And finally, the ending of the lesson. So these are questions that I can ask myself, and hopefully that you can run through them very quickly when you think of your lesson to ask yourself as well. Because in a language lesson, particularly, these questions will have real relevance. So let's think about this. Where does the learning often take place? Here's a structure of a PPP, a presentation practice production lesson. If I were to ask you to look at this and tell me where the lesson the learning takes place, where would you say? In the chat box. The practice and production, okay. In the presentation, so the teacher presentation is where the students learn. Yeah, okay. Someone said when they get feedback from the teachers there, but it just scrolled away far too quickly. Simon again, okay, great, thank you, Simon. Good, you're all correct. There of course is learning throughout the lesson. The presentation, the teacher will present language. Hopefully the students will learn from that. The practice, they'll start to understand it better, and the production, they'll be able to put it into practice. But my focus here is on the feedback, because from my experience, a lot of the teaching and particularly the learning comes in the feedback stages to confirm, to clarify, and to make sure students understand the concepts or the language that the teacher is trying to get across. So the feedback and the interaction, of course, between the students in the activity. So some examples of this might be peer feedback or teacher feedback. So peer feedback are peers working together to come up with answers. Teacher feedback, teacher providing either the correct answers or correcting mistakes. Hot and cold feedback. Hot means immediate. Cold means delayed feedback, maybe at the end of the lesson based on teacher's notes. And then we have think, pair, share. Students consider it by themselves, they share with a partner, and then they share with the whole class. So these are common ways to give feedback, and I think it's important in our lesson that we do plan that in. Something called Ppt feedback is something I like to plan in at the end of any significant activity, not at the end of every activity, but any significant activity where there's been a freer use of language. And by PPT, I don't mean PowerPoint presentation, because in fact, I do find that many teachers spend far too much time on creating a beautiful PowerPoint presentation, but perhaps less time on the lesson plan. So by PPT, I mean, can we plan in peer feedback, teacher feedback? Because often peers can learn as much from each other as they can from the teacher, and the teacher, in essence, can only speak to one or two students in the lesson anyway. So, excuse me, this gives the students a chance to compare and share with others before the teacher clarifies, and there's a real learning opportunity there. So PPT in this case is referring to the feedback you plan into your lesson. So how does that build into our planning? Well, this is a common lesson plan stage. And again, as teachers, we often don't have time to write out detailed full lesson plans, but these are common aspects of a lesson plan that you might see certainly in a stage. You have the stage objective, which I do think is important, but I don't see very often. It's something that we could consider. The setup, the task, the feedback, and the thinking skills focus, if we can develop that. And those stages are something called the task cycle. Setting up the task, doing the task, and feeding back on the task. We need to make sure those three stages are clearly planned to support students' learning. If the do section is autonomous, the students are learning by themselves, but there's no guarantee they're going to get the correct idea, or they may not be clear on the idea. So the feedback is really important to plan into our lesson and make sure it's there, for me, explicitly within the lesson plan, just to remind us that it's something that we need to really focus on. And if it's PPT or peer-peer teacher, then really the students get a chance to share together as well as the teacher's final clarification. So I think this is a useful way of structuring. Interaction patterns, this is nice if we can put it in, because it gives us an idea of really how student-centered our lesson is. If it's all T to SS to T, then we know it's going to be quite student-centered and more lecture-like than class task-based. So let me just throw a few acronyms at you. Here are some common acronyms with planning. Can you use them to get across to the desert island before the sharks devour you? Please, in the chat box, if you can go from left to right, tell me what the acronyms stand for. Let's see what you come up with. I'll just look at the chat box up here. I see there's a few. Okay, good. We've got a few here. So are you moving across? TTT, teacher talking time. Good. So we're going across the top here. Good. Could be test, teach, test, or teacher talking time. Good. Okay. Higher order thinking is bottom left. Good. So then we want to keep going to the right. Teacher feedback. Good. Teacher feedback's in the top middle. Task-based learning, TBL. Good. T, teacher. Good. Student talking time. Excellent. Good. Excellent. So I think we've got instruction checking questions. Wonderful. So we have others like DFB, which is delayed feedback. I just showed you a moment ago. PC, peer correction. PFB, peer feedback. So I'd like to ask you now, this activity, was I reviewing, was I testing, or was I teaching? Reviewing. Okay, good. Could be the first two. It's a bit of both, isn't it? Because some of them I'd mentioned fleetingly, but others I hadn't mentioned. So those I hadn't mentioned, essentially it's just a test. I'm testing you to see if you know what they are. And if you don't, then maybe I need to teach them. So this is where we need to think about our task type. What is it focusing on? Review, test, or teach? So let's take that forward to objectives. I'm going to put 5 things that we focus on for objectives. The first two are important because we want to make sure we consider why and what we're teaching. And we also want to be able to reflect back on what we've taught to make sure we have taught it. If we haven't, we need to make sure we teach it again, because this may reflect the curriculum guidelines and the syllabus that we're trying to teach, and students may be tested on this at the end of the semester. We also want to make sure the lesson's meaningful, it's logical, and of course it's achievable. We can do it within the time we have. And finally, it's a record that you have. Now, there may be other things we can use objectives for, but these for me are 5 key points. So when we do that, we mentioned SMART in the last activity, and the SMART, of course, I hadn't introduced, so it was a test, but let me do so now. When we are writing objectives, we want to make sure we're writing 1 or 2, for me, primary objectives, key objectives for the lesson. But there may be secondary objectives, things like thinking skills that you want to develop in addition to the key lessons. So we can have more than 1 objective. We also want to think about personal aims, and this is more a reflective practice for teachers. That is there anything that you want to try or to improve? Maybe you got some observation feedback, something that you want to make a focus for yourself, and that's also useful. And we want to follow the SMART method, and it was mentioned in the chat, which is great. And this is making your objective specific, clear in the objective, so we know exactly what we're teaching. We want to make it measurable, something we can check. Did we teach it? We want to make it achievable. Can we teach it in that 45 minutes, for example? Relevant, is it something useful to my students? How? And time bound. What is the limitation that we have in terms of time? So we want to be smart with this. Now that's all very well, but what do I mean by that? So let's look at how we might write an objective or an outcome. An objective is generally an aspiration for the lesson, something we want to do in the lesson. And when we write this in English, we often do it using the present simple tense. However, with an outcome, we're thinking about an expected result. So often when we write this in English, we use the future perfect. And you see at the beginning of each, we're already making it time bound by saying, by the end of this lesson, in this lesson. So that's giving us that time bound objective that we need. And then we need to make sure it's S, M, A, and R. So the example I have here, how to identify and pronounce the 3 different ed sounds in past simple regular verbs. So id, t, and d. So that's what I would want to achieve in that lesson. Here are some examples of not so good objectives, or they are objectives, not. We can see that in some of these, they're too vague. They're not clear enough for me. Transport words, what does that mean? What words? Even how many words do we want to focus on? And this will come down to MPF. Can we actually teach these words? Know the past simple. Know is a state verb. For me, that's not something that's achievable in 45 minutes. They will know the past simple. Students will read a text quickly. Yes, that might be a practical consideration, but actually we're not thinking about the skills that are being developed there. It's just something students will do and not really something we're trying to teach. So the present perfect tense, there's so many different aspects of that that we need to be clear on. So these are not great examples. Now, I am running out of time here, and I do apologize. This also means I will be very short on the questions at the end, but just to remind you, we will answer them if you put them in the Q&A box. So here are some examples that I put that are, for me, a bit better. I've underlined some key parts that I think we can use to check. So again, by the end of the lesson is allowing us to make it time bound, but we want to think about, did we introduce this? Did we practice this? Was it in this context? Was it these specific words? And that makes it very specific in terms of what we want to achieve. And taking the time to make that objective more detailed can really have benefits for you as a teacher. For example, post-lesson reflection and being able to check what you've taught. We can also use it as an outcome. Students will have read and analysed XXX text. This might be a text type, for example, a letter, a complaint letter, or it could be a specific text or story that you're trying to teach. And we mentioned GIST scanning, detailed reading techniques, so we can actually break it down into the techniques that we're trying to introduce. Again, you can tick those off as you go or at the end of the lesson to show that that's what you actually achieved. So by using the SMART technique, we are making sure that the lesson objectives are actually of use. Whereas the ones I showed you before seem more to be teachers writing down something because they have to write something down without actually thinking about what's going into the lesson, and maybe because they don't have much time. But as it's really a valuable reflective tool, and it can make sure our lessons are more effective. So I'm going to ask you to do this at the end of the lesson, at the end of the session today, because we won't shut down the webinar immediately. So have a think for a second about any objectives you could write based on that technique. I'd like to just go back to my objectives at the beginning of today. And although perhaps I should have said an objective was to get to the question and answer, I'm not going to do that effectively. But I can now go back and say, did I do this? Did I consider how we might promote student autonomy? Did I highlight different task types and their purpose? Did I look at key stages of planning? And did I cover the SMART technique? Perhaps at the end, we could have spent more on the last one, but yes, I can fairly confidently say I met my objectives because I can go back and check them as they're specific enough, measurable, and they were just achievable within the time frame that I had. So we're going to finish there, and I will hang on for a little bit at the end so you can put some of your objective ideas in the chat box. I do want to share this. This is some more videos we have, and they're short videos in our inventory that if you screenshot this now or you look at the slides when we share them, you can use the QR codes to access some short videos on writing effective classroom materials that you might find useful. I am going to go to the Q&A box now to answer a couple of questions, but we may not get them all, so I apologize for that. The certificates and recordings will be available through this QR code within 7 days, but hopefully before then. You can also see the previous webinar recording there as well. So please do put your objectives in the box there. I'll look and see what questions do we have here just to round us off? So I am looking at this. Can I apply Typhoon to a writing class? Well, let's see. You could do, but I think one of the advantages of Typhoon is it's quite fast moving, it's spontaneous, and that keeps the fun aspect. If students are answering through writing, for example, then that's something that, excuse me, that's something that's going to take away some of that spontaneity. So you might be able to adapt it that way, but I think it is better through oral question and answer myself. Why do we need to change our techniques if the existing one can help students achieve the desired outputs? For example, if PPP can help students? Well, that's a good question, but what is it developing? I think that's the question you might ask. Is it helping students to work towards a test and learning knowledge? That's great. That's, of course, important. But if we also want to develop other skills in students, and it's something that we touched upon in the Thinking Skills webinar, is we're not just teachers here to present knowledge, we're also developing skills such as being autonomous, being able to develop evaluative or analytical skills that students can apply in different contexts and ways. Then other techniques can help support that, whereas PPP can't, because essentially it's a teacher-centered, teacher-prescribed lesson. And of course, the teacher will know the students, but it may not actually meet the needs of all of the students because it's based on the teacher's idea. So certainly PPP is widely used. It's a legitimate way of teaching, but from my perspective, it's important we start to change that up a little bit to develop more than just the facts and the knowledge, but also the skills that students can apply to learn by themselves. Okay, are these characteristics somehow related to the differentiated learning model? I'm not sure which characteristics you're referring to, I mean, because I didn't see when you put that question in. So if you can add that again. Is there some rough rate to each of the 3 task cycles? A rough rate, I would say that, I'm not so clear on what the question means, but in terms of the task cycle in the lesson, the feedback is going to be very important, and often the feedback for me will take longer than the activity itself if there's really key learning points that have to be put forward. But that's something that you have to decide at the planning stage, because you have a limited amount of time, and you may plan fewer activities to expand the activities you have and really go into detail. So in terms of rate, I'm not sure if you mean percentage, but certainly the setup would be maybe 10–20%. The task could be 40–50%, and then the remaining 30% could be feedback, but that could be interchangeable based on what you're teaching and what the reaction of the students is. So thank you very much for that question. And if you want to adapt that question, we will put it in the Q&A sheet at the end when we put this on the downloadables. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar, and we've run a little bit over time. Thank you for staying. I see some of you are putting objectives onto the chat. I'm going to switch off video now, but I will make some comments in the chat for another 5 minutes. Thank you so much for attending. Please do join us on October 12th, where I'll be here with my colleague from Japan, who will be presenting teaching listening and moving into a different aspect of teaching. And hopefully you can take something from that that is of value too. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And it's been a pleasure to be part of this webinar. Thank you.